Welcome to the brief from Mesh, the show where Mesh's team sits down with the experts shaping the future of digital finance. I'm Damilola Rolaju, counsel at Mesh, and joining me today is Elise Susie Watts, Executive Director of Global Digital Finance and a member of our Policy Advisory Board.
Thanks so much for having me back. Love having these conversations with the Mesh team, and there's so much happening in the policy space globally, but particularly in the US. So I know it's going to be a really fun conversation today.
I'm looking forward to it. Before we start, the views shared today are our own and don't represent the official positions of any organizations. Nothing here is legal or financial advice. So, Elise, how about we set the table and start with clarity? At a baseline, what is clarity and what are your thoughts on it?
Clarity kind of fills in the gaps for everything that the Genius Act isn't. So Genius was purely focused on the regulation of stablecoin issuance and stablecoin issuers. It was all things stablecoin. Clarity is really aiming to pick up all of these other sweeping pieces in terms of crypto asset market structure. Because obviously, as I'm sure many of those who interact with Mesh or engage with digital asset markets know, crypto asset markets have a lot of nuances and behave very differently. There are new and innovative products, new ways of doing things, new tech stacks that are being implemented. And because of that, it was felt that there was definitely a need for a more cohesive piece of federal legislation that would regulate the whole of the crypto asset market and give more regulatory certainty to firms. And so really, that's what Clarity is aiming to do. And so I think that there's been obviously a lot of discussions about Clarity in the news, some of the delays, the kind of challenges around the markups and everything like that. And it's no surprise that this has been a challenging one to really get out the door and get over the line because it's so expansive and because of what it's trying to do and how it's trying to define things for the SEC and the CFTC. If we think back, for example, to how long it took to get MiCA done, that was kind of the EU's version of market structure, but also kind of wrapped stablecoins into it. It took a really long time. So it's no surprise, I think, that Clarity is proving challenging because there are so many details here that are important to get right. And I think maybe a question back for you is that obviously one of the things that Clarity is trying to do is it has this 3-bucket classification. You have the investment contract assets under the SEC, digital commodities under the CFTC, and then obviously stablecoins under Genius, like we said. What do you think from a Mesh perspective that you're seeing and the significance of having those categories written into law?
I think it's very important. As we saw under Gensler's regime at the SEC, there was a lot more regulation by enforcement. There were cases that builders had to utilize to figure out where exactly the SEC was when it came to crypto, whether or not it was a security. And Gensler, his perspective was that pretty much everything except for Bitcoin and maybe Ethereum were securities, but that was a lack of nuance. And a number of other agencies differed in their approach, but now as we're seeing Clarity come through, Clarity has had multiple iterations. FIT 21 passed the House, but nothing came from it. Then the Token Taxonomy Act in 2018, it is really important to provide builders actual understanding of what are the rules and trying to provide products in the US. I think the posture of the endless litigation and enforcement just isn't sustainable for people who want to build sustainable businesses. And even though the CFTC and the SEC have provided guidance, that guidance is not legally binding. And we're still waiting to see what actual rulemaking may arise. And with that rulemaking itself, it could be on shaky grounds. The current posture of the courts, they've withdrawn certain protections that were afforded to agencies on their prior legal precedents. So now courts have a lot more to say about what an agency can or not regulate based on the actual text of the statutes. We're just going to have to see what happens when legal challenges arise from the various rulemakings that will come out of the SEC and the CFTC to come out in this administration.
I totally agree with that. Moving on to that topic on a related one is that obviously we've then seen these kind of joint interpretive releases in the absence of clarity being passed that have come out from the SEC and the CFTC. So they're classifying various tokens as digital commodities. Obviously, the SEC has their crypto task force. We've seen the MOUs on coordination, and they've also granted a number of no action letters. I think that I would totally agree with you here, though, that while that is all extremely positive, and we very much as an industry, I think, commend the work that the SEC and the CFTC have done in the absence of clarity, it doesn't take away the need for the Clarity Act, because I think the industry really does need that stable legal foundation upon which to build the long-term infrastructure. And while guidance, no action letters, coordination, all of that is extremely helpful, it's not necessarily going to remain the same, for example, under a new administration. So take, for example, one of the things that was very quickly overturned under the current administration was SAB 121, which was an SEC accounting bulletin that many felt was really penalizing the digital and crypto asset industry and was making that on-balance sheet treatment of crypto assets very difficult from an institutional perspective. That was overturned rapidly as when the new administration came into place and the SEC had their sort of new marching orders, so to speak. But that could just as quickly be reinstated again under a different administration and a change in direction. And so I think it does still underscore the need for the Clarity Act in kind of cooperation with what we're seeing from the SEC and the CFTC. So I think very positive steps in the right direction, but you still need to have that kind of overarching permanence from a federal level as well. Did you have any additional thoughts on that, particularly maybe some of the no action relief that we've seen? Do you think that's helpful and a workable path forward as well?
I do think it's helpful, at least under this current administration. Actors in the space have an understanding of what this current SEC and CFTC believe the guidelines are. Outside of any other legislative authority, these will essentially be the rules, even if they may not be necessarily legally binding, but we won't see enforcement actions against builders for failing to register, for example, under the SEC, as long as they comport with what the SEC is providing as guidelines. And honestly, I think just from an enforcement posture in this administration, the Trump administration has been clear that it wants to see this industry flourish. And the only instances where I believe there will be enforcement actions, again, not legal advice, but in instances where a firm is facilitating gross consumer fraud, they're facilitating money laundering to Iran or Russian state actors, or even facilitating money laundering to the cartels, because these have been some of the administration's most pressing priorities. But outside of that, with these guidelines, if a builder is thinking about consumers, thinking about anti-money laundering protections, and thinking about how to create generally a good product, I think this guidance should be sufficient to build in this near-term future.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's broadly helpful. I'd love to get your thoughts on another topic, which is that central to Clarity, almost ironically, is that we have kind of gone back to stablecoins. And we seem to be talking about stablecoin yield quite a lot. Would you like to maybe just set the scene for people in terms of why are we seeing that? Where is the discussion now? And why has stablecoin yield become this big obstacle in a market structure bill that, as I said at the beginning, wasn't really meant to be about stablecoins?
Absolutely. We've thought that Genius decided everything stablecoins related, but this yield topic has been the loudest issue, particularly because it is probably one of the most expensive issues in the bill, because it really gets at the core business models, both of certain exchanges and banks. At the end of the day, no industry is going to just sit blindly by as their profit may be eroded. And so that's been sucking the oxygen out when it comes to Clarity, even though there are a whole host of other provisions that still need to be figured out. I think that's pretty much why the yield discussion has been such a huge debate. Do you feel that the debate is even warranted? As you said, things have been kind of established in Genius. How do you see it?
I think that one, it's always super complicated. And in my personal opinion, again, not legal advice nor an official position of others, but I think, in my opinion, it's never really a great idea when we start reopening pieces of legislation or trying to relitigate pieces of legislation. And I don't think that it should be the aim of anything that happens with clarity to overturn things that have been already set out in Genius. That being said, obviously, there is a genuine question here for some of the banks, like you said, who may be worried about deposit flight. However, I think that where we've seen them trying to draw this line is between a prohibition targeting passive holding rewards versus rewards that are functionally more like credit card points or transaction fee rebates, which actually have a place in the financial system. And there's no reason that those kind of broader rewards should be prohibited, because they're not a substitute for deposits and therefore should not contribute to deposit flight. That's where a lot of the industry debate has been centering around lately, how this is categorized within Clarity and where you can draw that line in terms of activity based and limiting it to certain transaction events. And so I think that's where we're really trying to come down on with the markup. I think you're absolutely right that there's a number of other issues that are also really important in Clarity, as we talked about at the beginning. I'm hopeful that maybe we can come to a compromise on this. And I think that it is important to try to finish this piece of legislation. But I do equally come back to what I said before, that I do think the Genius Act already provides quite a lot of clarity, no pun intended, but I do think that the Genius Act, we shouldn't be trying to relitigate it at this point. And so hopefully instead it can just be a drawing of that narrow line, really clearly defining it, and then also hopefully seeing a bit more guidance come out from the OCC as well, who also have, as I'm sure many are aware, an open notice on proposed rulemaking at the moment, where they also pick up on this issue again. What's important is to not try to go beyond or make more restrictive the prohibition that is in Genius, which should still allow for those activity-based rewards, similar to what we see in other areas of financial services. So hopefully that is the direction of travel. I know many in industry are responding to the OCC's NPR at the moment, and I think it's very important that industry do so, and that also we have consistency between what the OCC does and what also eventually comes out in Clarity, because obviously otherwise that would cause a mismatch as well if we didn't see that consistency there.
I agree. Genius already established the foundation, and we're seeing OCC and other agencies issue rules to build on that foundation. And so even if Clarity doesn't pass it, the OCC's current position, which mirrors the compromise, as you mentioned, is being discussed right now in Congress, proposed by Senators Alsobrooks and Tillis, is just going to be the law once the OCC's rulemaking is finalized. So it's either that point is decided through Congress or it's decided through rulemaking. Either way, it seems that will be the path forward. And as you mentioned, reopening prior past legislation is a very precarious process, particularly because of how difficult it is to get anything passed in the first place. And creating more points of contention just makes the entire bill just that much harder to pass.
Absolutely. And I guess maybe one thing that would be interesting to touch on here is that I think it's not any longer, when we think about the discussions we're seeing around Clarity, this isn't just sort of crypto versus TradFi or SEC versus CFTC. We have a number of different parties that are all trying to see how this could develop. We have your sort of traditional crypto industry backers. We have the banks. We obviously have the regulators who have their views, as we talked about with the OCC. But then we also have different different kind of complications between Democrats and their demands versus what we're seeing as a more Republican side of the proposals. And so I guess maybe would be interested to get your view as someone sitting on the East Coast looking at all this. Do you think that this bill will truly be able to survive so many kind of different cooks in the kitchen? Will we be able to really resolve across all these different parties?
Honestly, I'm not sure. We have the industry battle on yield. Then we have some of the more partisan and substantive battles that deal with anti-money laundering provisions, consumer protections, ethics restrictions, and even the prohibition on prosecuting DeFi developers under 18 USC 1960. And those are very serious issues. I don't know how far they've actually been resolved. I've heard that there's reporting that there's movement, but there are a lot of different stakeholders. But right now, Senate Democrats have the biggest veto because no bill will pass filibuster. I just don't know. Yield conversation aside, if we'll be able to get to not only clarity coming out of committee, but it passing the full Senate, then reconciliation with the House. Without these other points, it's supposed to be a markup at the end of April. I'll be interested to see what these Senate Democrats are saying about these other provisions and whether there will be some daylight or things can actually sail through, because this is a priority for the administration, but there are a number of issues that particularly the Senate is weighing right now. I know that's a bit of a half answer, but it's really just going to be wait and see. But I think there are a lot of headwinds right now that will make passage unlikely, particularly if it doesn't occur before the summer recess.
I completely agree with that. And I think that also what so often that I feel like is important to remember, especially in discussions with the crypto and digital asset industry, is that politics is so much bigger than crypto, and there are so many other issues on the table. And as you say, a lot of times these other additional provisions that might get added in, they are about broader political dynamics. These are sometimes about broader trade-offs and things that are happening in other sectors as well. Financial services aside, everything else that's happening from both a political and geopolitical perspective can also affect and weigh into any particular decision that is being made from an actor on a particular bill. And so I think that's really important to remember as well. Obviously, there is a lot of care from both sides on these issues, but it's not so straightforward as, do you like the crypto industry and want it to scale? There are many, many, many other factors at work here, and politicians are very busy people. And so I think it's always important to remember that when thinking about these debates. It's not always as simple as just being about the actual substance or technical drafting of the bill. But back to your point, I am very hopeful that something can get done before summer, but I agree with you. If we don't get it done before, then also probably don't remain massively optimistic. So maybe just on that note, to kind of think about walking through the path forward. So as you were alluding to, we're looking to hopefully get a markup before the end of April. We would then hopefully see a Senate floor vote and reconciliation with the Ag Committee version, reconciliation with the House version, and presidential signature. That's quite a lot to get done. It's a pretty ambitious wish list of things to do. My question is, because both of us have expressed our hesitancy about if this doesn't get done before summer, do you think that if the Republicans lose the Senate majority in November, this will change the dynamics for clarity entirely?
Absolutely. And I think it is likely that, statistically speaking, either the Republicans lose the House or the Senate, because typically, as you know, the party in power in the White House that also controls both chambers of Congress typically loses one of those houses during the midterms. And as I mentioned before, in the Senate, at least, the Democrats have a strong veto with the 6 members that are required to pass filibuster. And if the Senate flips and then the Democrats are in the majority, it makes even bringing clarity to the floor that much more difficult. And the same is true in the House if the Democrats take control of the House. I think it'd be particularly interesting looking specifically at the committees. If the Democrats take the House, it will be Representative Maxine Waters chairing the House Financial Services Committee. She has had some skepticism when it comes to, but she has had the ability and the willingness to work and actually put together legislation that makes sense. On the other side, look at the Senate Banking Committee. If the Democrats take control and they take the gavel, it will be Senator Elizabeth Warren chairing the Senate Banking Committee. She's been much more of a vocal critic of the industry just writ large. And so the Democrats would, at a minimum, seek more concessions for clarity. And then even just thinking about what it would look like in the timeline for passage, it will look just completely different, particularly as the Democrats likely don't want to give the Trump administration much political wins.
I agree with that as well. And then I think that then what I would be interested to see is that if the market feels like they do have enough certainty in the meantime, do they feel like they have enough of that certainty from the SEC and CFTC that we were talking about earlier to stay and scale in the US? Or do they feel like it's a little bit too risky of a place to build and to continue to grow as an industry? A lot of times what we've seen in other markets is that you will sometimes see outflows based on regulatory uncertainty, and people will go to where they actually know for sure that if the administration changes, you're not going to see a change in enforcement posture like we talked about earlier. So I will be really interested to see how that all plays out as well, especially in comparison to what we're seeing in other jurisdictions.
Absolutely. I'm curious from your perspective on the other side of the pond, how have you seen builders in this space vote with their feet regarding digital assets policy in the UK?
So the UK is an interesting one, and in the kind of context of more broadly as well, what's happening in the EU, because the UK also doesn't have a fully fledged framework yet, though it is opening its licensing gateway at the end of this year. It's opening its licensing gateway in autumn. It's finalizing its policy frameworks and its kind of version of market structure throughout this summer. So I think that we have certainly seen some exodus from the UK in that interim period, though, towards not only jurisdictions like the US, where it's been very crypto friendly, I would say, especially in light of recent actions, but also, of course, to MiCA, which is live in the EU, because it does provide that regulatory certainty. If people do, as you say, vote with their feet and decide to stay in the UK, I think that will really be determined by what we see from the final rules that come out. So unlike the kind of political discussions that are happening in the US at the moment, in the UK, instead we're at the rulemaking phase from the regulators. We already have that kind of primary legislation. And so it's these rulemakings that are coming out from the FCA, from the Bank of England, for both stablecoins and the broader market structure. The EU obviously has all of that already. And while some people obviously might complain about MiCA and not love every aspect of it, at least you know what you're getting. You know what the requirements are. You can go and speak to your regulator about it in whatever jurisdiction you choose to establish in. And then you do have the passporting across the various jurisdictions. We do have, obviously, other places around the world that we have focused on as well, like Singapore, the UAE. We have seen other jurisdictions, Hong Kong comes to mind as well, where they also have pretty clear frameworks. Australia has come online recently with their various bills too. And so I think that really, there's two things that I would say it's important to watch in terms of the movement of the industry is that one, they will be looking at, does this jurisdiction have regulatory certainty and regulatory clarity and legal certainty? And if it does, is it regulatory certainty that we actually feel is scalable for our business? Because if it's regulatory certainty, but the rules are unworkable, then they will likely have to choose rules in other jurisdictions. But if it's regulatory certainty that they feel is still enabling their business to scale, then those will be the most popular jurisdictions, I think, that we will see firms going to. And so in that sense, I don't think that the US or the UK are really too far behind, provided they can get that regulatory certainty in place over the next couple of years. That being said, I think if it drags on any longer, though, or if we see more delays in that case for either the US or the UK, I would be concerned that we might see firms going elsewhere. What about you? What have you seen? Mesh is scaling, looking at its EU business as well. You guys obviously have been looking closely at Clarity. How do you guys feel about those from a compliance infrastructure perspective as you look across the landscape of other firms and partners you have that are operating globally?
For us, it's a bit of trying to understand and have a better perspective of what the requirements are. For multinational corporations, there is some difficulty in having to comport with multiple jurisdictions, regimes, particularly when they may not have that much overlap or consistency. You've seen with what we're doing regarding MiCA in the EU, we're sourcing local talent to help us better understand what it takes to be compliant. And that seems to be the best approach for businesses building in this space, having the ability to source local individuals in the jurisdiction that you're expanding to get their take on what it actually looks like on the ground. As you know, there are the rules and the regulations, but then how are regulators actually enforcing them? What are the things that you actually need to know to build responsibly in a given jurisdiction? One of the things back in the US that I think it's going to be interesting as we see it develop, particularly outside passage of Clarity, would be the states stepping in to enact licensing regimes to fill the void of Clarity. As you know, there's a New York BIT license, which is a very thorough licensing regime. And then California is also having their digital asset license coming online. And so one of the things that I'm curious to see, again, outside passage of Clarity, if other large states in the US start to do the same, such as Illinois, Texas, and Florida, and seek to capture some of those licensing fees and try to protect their consumers. And so that's going to be interesting. So for us, it's 50 states and territories having to navigate various licensing regimes that are already in place and that are emerging. Then globally, keeping an eye out for regimes that are popping up in different countries where we believe it would be important to have foothold in.
I agree. I think that's really interesting. I grew up in Illinois, so personally interested to see how they fare in the state race competition to scale various industries. I agree. I think that you see actually on the domestic level in the US, it's just a sort of microcosm of what we're seeing in terms of the competitive pressure across other jurisdictions. And realistically, both states compared to one another, but also various jurisdictions around the world, they have a strategic choice to make about what part of the crypto and digital asset industry they want to stimulate and support in scaling. And do they really want to attract this business into that part of their economy? If so, what kind of requirements are they going to put into place so that it can integrate with their broader financial services industry? And if not, that's a strategic choice as well. So I think that there really is going to be this sort of interesting tension that we will see between those jurisdictions that really embrace and support the industry scaling and those that maybe don't for whatever broader economic or other reasons. And so I think that will be really interesting to see play out on the geopolitical stage as well.
Absolutely.
One final topic that I think would be really interesting is obviously we've talked a lot about what all this means from a policy perspective, but what does this mean for the ecosystem? And obviously Mesh really sits at the heart of the payments infrastructure layer. And so what do you think if Clarity does pass? What does that mean practically from an infrastructure perspective? Will that lead to more fragmentation or will we see more order across the markets?
One of the things that really interested in seeing when the final text of Clarity comes out, how each type of entity is categorized, because there have been certain drafts where any party that exchanges a digital asset will be considered a digital commodity, would therefore have to register under the CFTC. But there are some slight exemptions for payments related transfers. And so one of the things sitting at Mesh, it'd be interested to see how that plays out. Will the regime only cover the typical exchanges such as Coinbase, or when there's incidental transfers of crypto to facilitate a payment, does that also mean and require a CFTC registration? And it also has provisions in Clarity under certain drafts where the CFTC can carve out certain businesses and certain business models. Really interested in seeing what the final text looks like. I'm really interested to see how the CFTC decides to shape up the different categories of businesses that would require registration. And then from there, one of the big questions for me, what this means for preemption of state licensing requirements, including state money transmitter laws. So whether or not registering under the CFTC under clarity would preempt the need for a business to register with the states under their money transmitter licensing or their digital asset licensing regimes. And that's going to be really important as we talking about fragmentation, particularly from a regulatory perspective. Outside of registration and the various categories of businesses that clarity will essentially categorize and create, I'm interested to see how much more assets will then come on chain and then the new innovative business models that clarity will help bring forward. I must believe that trillions of dollars of assets will come on chain, and it's not going to be because of the fluctuating price of Bitcoin, but because there will be more real world assets that will be tokenized and put on chain. And at the end of the day, one of the things that clarity doesn't solve is the fragmentation from the various blockchains, the various wallets, and then the various exchanges and providers that will arise post clarity. And at the end of the day, it still needs that connective tissue to facilitate the ease and flow of digital assets and fiat currency. Mesh would be really well placed post clarity and even without the passage of clarity to be that infrastructure provider.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that, as you say, Mesh is very well situated in that instance because as the market continues to grow and scale, as institutions come online, as more real world assets come on chain, there will be more and more of a demand for compliant connectivity infrastructure. And that fundamentally isn't something that I think that we should necessarily be even looking to regulation to solve. That sort of interoperability and connectivity is something that players like Mesh are already solving from an industry perspective. And so I'm personally really excited to continue to see that grow and scale. And I think that we will only see, as more regulatory clarity comes into place in the US and globally, we'll only continue to see that scalability in market activity, provided that infrastructure layer is there. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
I'm excited as well. Any other final thoughts from you regarding the impact of clarity? We've seen the impact of the passage of Genius on the stablecoin market from a volume perspective and a adoption perspective, particularly from institutional actors. Do you think that clarity will also facilitate that same impact?
I absolutely think so. And I think that there's definitely precedent for that from what we've seen in other jurisdictions. I think that we've seen that basically the more regulatory certainty that you have, the greater interest that there is from the market in being able to scale. And that makes sense, of course, because while obviously startups and scale ups are able to be more agile and flexible and shift with a changing, potentially regulatory environment, for large institutions, they have to notify their supervisors before they make big decisions. They have to think really carefully about what the compliance landscape looks like before they might get involved in a new asset class or deploy capital in a certain direction. And so I think that if we truly want to have that large scalability, then clarity and these broader frameworks are really, really critical, coupled, of course, with, as you say, the importance of state level frameworks, the guidance from the SEC and CFTC. It all has to come together to make that compliance landscape. So I think that it is a really important piece of legislation to talk about. I think it will have a really large impact, and I just hope that we can get it done before summer.
Absolutely. I think that's a great place to end here. Elise, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. That's a wrap of this episode of The Brief. Elise, where can people find you and GDF?
You can find me at Elise Susie Watts on LinkedIn, or you can find GDF at gdf.io. And what about you?
You can find me on LinkedIn at Diarolaju and Mesh at MeshPay on LinkedIn and X. And please subscribe to The Brief on YouTube at Mesh-Pay, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Welcome to the brief from Mesh, the show where Mesh's team sits down with the experts shaping the future of digital finance. I'm Damilo Larolaju, counsel at Mesh, and joining me today is Elise Susie Watts, executive director of Global Digital Finance and a member of our policy advisory board. Before we get into it, the views shared today are our own and don't represent the official positions of any organization. Nothing here is legal or financial advice. Welcome to the brief from Mesh, the show where Mesh's team sits down with the experts shaping the future of digital finance. I'm Damilo Larolaju, counsel at Mesh, and joining me today is Elise Susie Watts, executive director of Global Digital Finance and a member of our policy advisory board. Before we get into it, the views shared today are our own and don't represent the official positions of any organization. Nothing here is legal or financial advice.